It really has taken off since COVID started, but the long and the short is that this is still a project that takes a decade, and we're largely more or less in year 4 of it, or 3 at best. This is not over yet. It's not even close. Welcome back, everyone. Today on Geopolitics Tyberiusd, we're going to be talking about the big O money. You know, that thing that makes the world go round, whether you love it, whether you hate it, whether you couldn't care less, is that it's in everybody's minds today because inflation is the name of the game. And so we're going to be talking about not only the money and how it works, but also just in what makes it valuable and why one day you can have it to where your dollar is worth quite a bit more than it is the next day. And so without further ado, let's get into it. It's going to be a lot of fun. You know, we've talked a lot about money on this particular show, and that's probably not going to end anytime soon because it is integral to the way that we, basically operate. But what is money? In a nutshell, is that money is a medium of value. It's basically a good that is exchangeable for all other goods and services. And the reason that we have this is simply out of the fact that if you make oil or grain or, t-shirts or any of these things, it's really hard to trade that directly for all the things you need because only so many people need t-shirts, so many people need shoes, so many people need grain, or at least so much of it, right? After that point, it's really, really hard to trade. But if you have something that's kind of like this intermediate kind of thing that everybody can, get on, is that basically you think of it like a spider web, right? Everyone goes to the center and then pulls out what they need or puts in what they don't need. And it's a very, very flexible system that has allowed for modern economic growth all the way back to antiquity. There's a couple of types of money, though. Some of them a little older, some a little more modern. Some of these are pretty rudimentary. Commodity currencies, as an example, right? It's a currency made of standardized metals. You're all familiar with this. It's a gold coin, a silver coin, platinum, a few other things out there. But basically, it's a standardized set of material goods that is used repeatedly over and over again. Next, we have representative currency. We'll talk about this a little bit more in detail as we go, but the long and the short here is that this is a commodity currency that is represented by another thing. It's a security issue and also a bit of a locomotion issue. A lot of these metals can get pretty heavy pretty quickly. Next, we have fiat currency, and man, this one's a doozy. Modern money is actually the least straightforward one that we possibly can have. There's a number of theories of how fiat currency actually works, but we'll definitely get into that later in the show. But pretty much you can break it down to this. There are 3 major camps on how these are all limited down by factor, and they're all a little bit in disagreement with each other. And of course, we have an addition to the list, cryptocurrency. A new addition to the list that is quite interesting, however, may not be as viable as you think it is. I gotta get into some economics to explain a number of these things. And believe me, I would rather not do it because this can get incredibly complicated, but I am going to make this as short and as sweet and as simple as I possibly can for you. You guys know how I work. I am semi-professional, right? I take the big brain ideas and I digest them down and make them, easy for you guys to understand, whether you're a big brain academic or somebody who is freshly new, as I try to make it where this is as easy to understand as possible. However, when it comes to this one, it's starting to get a little complicated, and it's going to get a little more complicated as we go. But this is a normalized version of supply and demand. Now, in a basic, simple form, this is pretty straightforward, right? The more that you have of a price increase, the more that people want to supply that thing because they're making money off of it. However, the more that the prices is, the more that demand, and the people that want to spend money on it, decreases because they're obviously putting money towards that instead of something else, right? Because opportunity costs. Long and the short here is that there is an equilibrium that you will find, or a meeting point, that these two interactions will have, and that sets the determining price. However much that people feel comfortable with making on it versus how much people feel comfortable on spending on it, you are going to find is the economic equilibrium point. This is integral to the way that money works. However, that does not mean that all supply and demand charts are created equal, and we will get into that later. First, we're going to get back into commodity currency. This is the oldest form of currency that you can pretty much find. This is a money that is represented by a material. And largely what it is that whether that particular material is of wealth is pretty much guaranteed. But what isn't guaranteed is that those materials aren't semi-form, right? So you can have gold, but if you don't have it in any kind of standardized, process, it's really hard to just chip off a piece of gold and hand it to somebody, because you need to make an exchange, right? So what we did is that we took all these precious metals or things that we really wanted to trade with, and we made standardized instruments of them, if you want to put it that regard, so we could trade that on a normal operating practice. We had coins for a penny, a nickel, a dime, $1, $5, that kind of thing. And so you knew what you were giving and what you were getting out, and it was pretty easy to haggle because you knew like some kind of standard, right? You weren't trying to figure out, how to denominate 37 cents. And more particularly, cuts down on the amount of effort you have to put in to bartering. The pros overall is that this is generally standardized, these are often metals, and they can largely actually be anything that's relatively scarce or, allotted for you can use as a currency, and societies have been very interesting in this. We've seen societies that have had seashells. We've literally seen a society that used rocks, and if anyone is a big Fallout 4 fan out there, is that in a society where bottle caps can't be made, is that old natural bottle caps from before the nuclear apocalypse happens to be the currency for that given society because no one can make them, therefore they are scarce, and you have a basically domestic economy run off of that. And that is actually one of the most realistic things I've seen in video gaming in a long time. That's really, really cool. Getting into the flaws of commodity currency, I know I only have one here, but there's actually kind of 2 to 3. First and foremost is what we call debasing, where somebody takes that gold coin and they mix another metal into it that's worth a lot less, and so they claim, hey, I have a gold coin here, it's worth $1, but in actuality it's 50 cents because half the material isn't the gold. The second and third issues are the same issues that representative currencies have, however they take it to a different degree, so we'll hit that next. So, let's talk about representative currency. This is money that is backed by material but is a substitute. So you can have that gold, you can have it in bars, you can have it in coins, but you know what? After a while, all that gold gets pretty heavy, gets hard to move. A lot easier to take a piece of paper that says it's worth, 50 of those, or 100 of those, or even 1,000 of those, and just, put it in your pocket and run around with it. And you can keep it down to a bare necessity here. There's a level of security, and there's a level of transportation that really works out for representative currencies. In the event of a security, is that you as a representative, you as the holder of the representative currency have basically an IOU that you can trade in for gold, right? Well, if somebody steals that, if you notify the person who has the gold, because either you own it or you have somebody who is representing it on your behalf, you can shut that process down to even where they say, hey, I have the IOU, I'd like it back, that you can be like, no, that's stolen, and you do not get that, and by the way, you're under arrest, or we'll pay you a beating. The other side of this is easy, simple modes of transportation. Paper or cotton, as most dollars are kind of made up of now, are a lot lighter than bricks of gold and coins. Coins can really add up if you've noticed if your piggy bank gets heavy from time to time. A lot of advantages here are pretty straightforward in the regards that a lot of the advantages of commodity currency are very akin to what we see and representative currencies. These are largely standardized. However, this is where all the benefits kind of start going to hell, is that we talked about the security, we talked about the standardization, we talked about the ease of transportation. The problem is that once you get into representative currencies, you have an issue. What happens if what is represented and what is become 2 different values? These are normally the things that really have an issue for representative currencies, and why a lot of people that want to go back to them, I don't think really understand what they're talking about. First and foremost, you can have different variations on how much of a representative currency is actually going to embody the commodity that it's representing. As an example, you can have a 1-to-1 ratio, right? For every ounce of gold that you have a corresponding amount of dollars or, currency to represent that. But it doesn't have to be that way. It can be half that. It can be a quarter that. It can be triple that. What it largely comes down to is straightforward as this. Number one is that can the commodity currency facilitate general economic development? And in the modern world, the answer is absolutely not. There isn't enough gold. There isn't enough silver. There isn't enough platinum. There's enough anything to do a one-on-one ratio at all. And so anyone who's just simply saying, hey, you know what, we need to go back to the gold standard, I'm sorry, you don't understand basic economics. You are talking about a world that has $93 trillion worth of economic activity that you now want to enshrine into a couple of precious metals. Number one, you don't have one precious metal that's enough, but even like the top three don't even cover into this. So a 1-to-1 ratio is out. But even if you wanted to do a 1-on-1 ratio, here's the issue. What happens if today your gold is worth, $2 an ounce, but then all of a sudden tomorrow it's worth it's worth $2.01? What do? Do you make the extra cent in the currency, or do you have a disparaging value between the commodity and the representative currency? And the reality is that happens all the time, every time. Is that in these macro systems that can have literally billions of dollars, if not trillions of dollars within circulation, is that it simply just gets too easy to change the value relative to the representative currency versus the commodity. And so what we did was that we started doing fractional reserve banking. What that is pretty straightforward. A fraction of what you have put side back, you keep, and then you just dump as much of the currency that you desire into the open market. And so, as an example here, you have, by a factor of 5, the amount of currency in circulation that you have backed up. And anyone who wants to come back and trade that in for the relative currency can do so. So they can trade in the currency for gold. However, if everyone does it at the same time, your currency just goes up in smoke. Now, that has only happened pretty much once in the American history, and that was 1929. This was a huge deflationary spiral where everything went to hell and we had banking runs. However, we'll talk about deflation when we get to the inflation part. The long and the short is this. You can't keep the values at a 1-to-1 level, which is one of the biggest security factors here and why a currency can absolutely go to hell. And so, number one, that's off the table. Number two, even if you don't just do that, you still have all the problems that comes with a commodity currency, but now you've added even more. And so, while this worked for a time, I don't expect any modern government or almost any modern institution to want to go back to representative currency. All right, let's talk about the fiat currency. This one is a little bit interesting in the regards that there's really 3 major theories here, but no one's really quite sure how it all breaks down, right? So on one side, we're just going to make it straightforward. This is money that is not backed by material. So how do you regulate them? There's 3 schools of thought. The first is credit issued or credit creation theory. This is largely that currency is loaned into existence, that it takes the value within a society, it loans itself into being the manifestation of that value. So think about like you have something that you find valuable, such as the grain that you make, but you need to trade that grain with somebody else. What money does is that it provides a value sink to where I will give up my grain to get money, and then that money is representative of the value of that grain. When I go to trade out my money for something else that I need, like oil, is that as a super commodity, it does have a little bit of that natural trade value, but the real value that people believe this actually has is that it's taking the amalgamation of value of all the things that it interacts with, and it takes a little bit of it at a time. And so these are largely balanced by treasuries, is that when a government prints off money, it will take out a treasury of its own self, or its or its reserve bank will take out its own treasury and saying, hey, look, for every dollar that we've printed, we have an official IOU, and so we recognize that, all this can be cashed back in as far as value. Next is the common exchange theory. This is pretty related to this. This is largely from the Austrian economists. However, they take one step back. They believe that the value of the currency is simply related to the idea, is simply valued on its currency interactions with other things. So basically, the fact that it's valued as a trading commodity is its sole and innate value. There's nothing actually pinning it to the floor. On the other side of that is that it's generally assumed to be a Ponzi scheme. You have to keep having people buy in and buy in and buy in to keep the value up in that. Well, I honestly disagree with this one, and I'll talk about that and why in the cryptocurrency section, because this is exactly why crypto doesn't work, and we'll get there in just a moment. Last but not least, we have what is known as the state monopoly theory, but you may know it more likely as modern monetary theory, or MMT. Largely, this is assumed that the state has a monopoly on IOUs, in regards that it's a little bit like that credit creation theory, but not 100%. It's that the state literally can come in and say, I guarantee that there is a value in this, this, and that. And so as long as I can make good within that guarantee, the state has power, and it's only balanced by the taxation, right? You can't just give out limitless forms of value. You have to give it some kind of containment. And so largely what they do is they say, look, if we want to extend value and IOUs out, we can absolutely do that at our leisure, but we have to continuously start pulling some of that back into the system through taxation and either destroying it or recycling it through the system to maintain an ebb and flow. Really interesting idea. Not 100% set on that one. I largely go with more the credit creation idea and a little bit of the common exchange mixed in. Largely more with credit issued. Getting back into economics here, money is a really interesting supply and demand curve. Now, there's a lot of debate on exactly how... there's a lot of debate on exactly how the demand curve works for money. No one really agrees quite a bit, but this is where I'm going to throw my hat in the ring and let you guys assume this. Number one is that it's assumed to be inelastically supplied, but elastically demanded. And what does that mean? Elasticity in modern economics is largely assumed to be whenever you mess with the supply and demand curve, is that whenever you change 1 unit of price, do you get 1 unit of outcome? Or do you get more or less? If you get more units of outcome, this is assumed to be elastic. If you get less, it is generally assumed to be inelastic. And so what we usually find here is that when it comes to money, when it comes to currency, is that it's assumed to be supply inelastic, meaning that the amount supplied, depending on the price, is negligible compared to the change. As in, a government doesn't really give a flying crap how much it's valued at. They won't supply more simply depending on the price. What they want to consistently do is provide just a little bit more supply than they feel like is needed to continually lubricate the system and keeping the cost of capital down and easier to facilitate finance, trade, and economic growth. On the other side of that, it is largely assumed to be elastically demanded. And a lot of people kind of wonder why it's that. It's a little bit counterintuitive if you actually follow my drift here. What it means is this. While people will always have a demand for money, almost an infinite demand for money, is that the moment that they feel that their currency isn't working at the value that it's supposed to, they will radically and fundamentally change their spending habits. They will take their money all the live long day if you give it to them. However, if it actually means that their value is not going to maintain, they're not interested. What is the point of having money if you're literally just going to lose all the value that that money has? And this is why we see people take returns out of stock portfolios and, the Dow Jones, instead of buying treasuries or buying in money itself. It just has a better return. People are very persnickety about the demand at money because, well, you would love to have more. If it doesn't maintain its value, they largely will look for something else. All right, I gotta talk about the big crypto. What am I gonna say? Well, I've already kind of rained on the parade of some of the crypto bros here, so let's finish it out. Largely, this is virtual money, and what it does in theory is that it kind of brings back the scarcity of commodity currency, but allows it to be interfaceable pretty much anywhere with an electronic device. This is a pretty good idea in theory, right? Is that you just take something that can be used relatively anywhere, as long as you got like a nice little cell phone or what have you, is that as long as you can maintain an electronic internet connection, is that you all are on the same network and you all are participating under the same rules. And the way this largely works is pretty straightforward. You have a regulated amount of these cryptocurrencies, or let's just say just the one, right? You have a regulated amount. You're not supposed to have very much more added to the system. If it is, it's really, really slow, really time consuming, really expensive. What you do is that you have this particular currency, you can use it anywhere, and the way that it's put together is a technology called blockchain. It's basically an algorithm. This algorithm talks to anyone else that's within the system. And whenever somebody simply says, hey, I have more Bitcoin than anyone else in the system has registered, it flags it and says no. And so it's this weird technology that allows everyone to kind of play by the same rules because everyone has an active log of how much everybody else has. Now, that's not the actual way to explain it, but that's the way that it's been explained to me, and I know there's a more technical term for it, but basically simply is this. It has an underlying security feature to where no one can really cheat it. Now, there is a few ways to screw with it, but you can't just blatantly cheat it, and that's one of the strengths of cryptocurrency. The problem is that what they don't seem to realize is that the innate problem that killed commodity currencies are innate to cryptocurrencies on purpose. Is that you want to say, hey, look, there's only so much of it, so, it's going to maintain value. In theory, you're absolutely right. But the problem is that in a modern world where economic growth has been exorbitant, what do you do if everyone starts to buy in on cryptocurrency tomorrow, particularly Bitcoin or Ethereum or what have you? The value of that is going to shoot through the roof. No one's going to be able to afford it or transition into getting that currency, and the currency immediately collapses because it's no longer a viable entity. Literally, a success can lead to its failure because there just simply isn't enough of it to be accessed on an open market and to be used as a tradable surface. And this is why I don't believe that it's actually going to be really successful on that ground, but also it's not even commonly accepted today. Number one, there's a lot of them. You've got Bitcoin, you've got Ethereum, you've got Dogecoin, you've got a lot of them that are just out there in the blue that, are all competing against each other. And while why Bitcoin is obviously the biggest one is that it still hasn't maintained any kind of level of wide-scale acceptance, and I don't think it ever is going to. Now, if it were to somehow do so, Bitcoin is going to be somewhat of a viable currency, or any other cryptocurrency, is that it can be semi-viable, because as long as you have at least an innate group of active people who are participating in that system and use it for actual monetary exchange, you're good. The vast majority of this isn't, though. Most of this is literally a Ponzi scheme where you just have more people being interested in it. They see that Bitcoin for a long time there kept going up and up and up, and they want to get on the ride. But until you actually have it to where you can take your Bitcoin and go buy a Subway sandwich, it is far less likely to be used as an actual currency and more as a gimmick in a Ponzi scheme. I do not want to dissuade people from thinking that cryptocurrencies are just a dead horse. I do think they have a lot of vitality in being something that is very limited. There's a conversation in regards to the idea that a lot of central banks or major corporate banks are going to develop their own cryptocurrencies that they use between each other, and they can move value that way, and those currencies will absolutely be viable. The question is how many people are going to be let into that system. Just to show what this idea largely is that this is most commodity currencies, but crypto in particular hits this, and land hits this in particular, is that the supply of this particular commodity is simply flat or very, very close to flat. You can't really make any more of it, and that is a stabilizing price factor, and that only the demand for that will swing the price. And in theory, that's a good idea. But as I explained earlier, that can break because if you radically change the demand, the price goes absolutely to hell and it's unfeasible. This is where a few things get complicated for people. When you hear the term inflation, you hear an implied decrease in value. But then when you actually know what inflation is that you're sitting here, I'm like, why is my money getting less? That's not inflating, it's deflating. Well, the problem is that you have two things here, inflation and deflation, but you also have two factors here, which is monetary inflation and consumer inflation. And one of the crazy things that we've done, while not making a lot of sense to me, even as a person within economics, is that we didn't tie inflation to the actual value of the currency. We tied it to the values of the goods and services that that particular currency can buy. It looks a little ass backwards to most people, and I'll even say I think so too. But here's where it pretty much breaks down. A currency or money can inflate and deflate in value largely as its own independent operation. It's basically a trading commodity. It has value as that. However, certain currencies simply have more value than other currencies based upon what is being traded and how secure those trades are in regards to whether they are actually profitable or whether they're just there to serve an end. Money can inflate and deflate depending on the usefulness and the demand for that particular currency. Over the last 2 to 3 years, we have seen something that we haven't seen for quite a while. Usually the dollar would maintain a relative stagnant value. It wouldn't really go up, it wouldn't really go down, but compared to everybody else's is that it would kind of be the benchmark. But now recently that has changed because currencies can inflate and deflate. What we're seeing is that everyone is now wanting the dollar because it's now seen as more secure versus most other currencies are not. And so we are seeing this weird deal to where, at least weird by the common standards, the dollar is shooting through the roof and gaining value at the same time that most other currencies are rapidly depreciating in value, because the dollar can be used almost anywhere. Those currencies cannot. And in a world where supply chains are breaking down and basic goods and services are becoming harder to afford, what do you want? The currency that you can use anywhere, or the currency that you might be able to use in one nation or one region? The dollar is starting to kick butt, and it's going to continue to do so for quite a while. However, that leads into a really interesting part here. How is it that the dollar keeps going up, but inflation's at 8% and you're still paying more and more and more for your goods and services, whether it be lunch or whether it just be a TV, when you have a strengthening dollar? Shouldn't that not be the case? Well, two things here. Number one, consumer goods can inflate and deflate at value, and what we usually see here is that it continually inflates and not deflates, which is why your money is worth less. More often than not, the money actually isn't worth less, it's that the goods and services that you're buying are worth more. And while that may be confusing, it is a serious thing that I have to break down. Money has its own innate value, separate from each and every good and service that you buy. And what usually changes here is not that the currency actually changes in value all that often, but more likely the goods and services that you're buying changes. And most of the time that goes up because of something that we call the ratchet effect. The ratchet effect is pretty straightforward. Largely simply says that whenever a price goes up, it's really hard to pull it down. And the reason is twofold. Number one is that people get used to the norm of whatever that particular price point is. They set it in their budgets, they set it into their yearly forecast, and they largely want to go with it because it's easy. The other side of that equation is that it's really hard to pull the price points down on stuff from the top down. And while it's easy to do that because that's the final end products, is that whenever we see that, that usually leads to a deflationary crash. A deflationary crash is, in a nutshell, a deflationary spiral where you have a cascading of series of events to where an entire economy largely goes offline or gets radically reduced in its effective ability. One system goes offline, which leads to another failing and another failing and another failing. This is what happened in 2008. This is particularly what happened in 1929. So how is it that consumer goods can deflate while also maintaining stability? Well, the simple answer is that it has to start from the bottom and work its way up. It's usually very rare because of the ratchet effect, but it has to start at the base, bare bone stuff. Whether it's crude oil, whether it's ores and metals, whether it's agricultural services or forestry services, is that those bare commodities that are coming out of the ground have to be the first point in which the system openly costs less. And then if that starts, you can slowly ratchet that through the rest of the system and push price points down. Supply is always easier to meet to a situation than demand is. Let's get back to explaining that deflationary spiral. What happens in something like 2008 is that you have one particular market crash, particularly the housing market, right? You have anyone who was making a home at the time suddenly no longer able to afford making homes. And then suddenly all the people that they were buying from to make their homes no longer need to make the things that they were selling at a profit to continue going down the chain. And so you have the housing market go, then you'll have lumber go, then you'll have glass makers go, and then eventually you'll get all the way down to the guy who's chopping the trees. It is a cascading series of events. Now, obviously, that actually wasn't what really took off in 2008. The homes and their value crashed the banking system. The loans crashed before the assembly process did. However, what was worse is that banking is like the integral part where everybody is interconnected. When banking crashed, it didn't just crash the industries that were related to home ownership, it crashed everybody because you couldn't get your business loans. All of a sudden, you were looking at a higher cost of credit to purchase and buy things. And that was horrific for the entire system at large because that goes into finance, that goes into agriculture, that goes into mining, that goes into literally almost every single thing that we do. We are a credit-driven society, and this is the price that we pay for it. If the credit ever gets screwed up, we are screwed. To wrap this all up, I want to finish this out by saying that we have some issues when it comes to generalized inflation to where we think of monetary inflation and deflation, not as consumer inflation and deflation. Most of the time, when it comes to inflation, we're talking about consumer inflation. The goods and services are simply getting more costly compared to our dollars or our currency. And that is going to continue to happen. A lot of people like to say something along the lines that the United States printed too much money, and that's one of the biggest reasons that you're seeing inflation. However, that's just not the reality. While we have been printing money, and so has everybody else, is that the lines between what we see of inflation versus the amount of money that we print never really correlates out that well. What usually happens is that we see a rise in inflation due to demand of customer goods and services. And we have seen this plenty of times before. Back in the 1980s, it wasn't that we printed a bunch of money. We printed the money after the inflation happened. What largely happened in the 1980s is that you had a bunch of people called the baby boomers suddenly reach adulthood and started purchasing things and participating out through the economy at large. That pushed the cost of goods and services through the roof because it took over 10 years for these people to be integrated in the economy and supply to largely catch up with that. Today, what we're seeing throughout the system at large is that globalization has come to an end. The system that was built to facilitate the baby boomers entering the workforce and entering the global market has broken down. And so having cheap Chinese labor that is now building your tennis shoes and your basketballs to anything else no longer is viable due to COVID and the fact that they're having some issues geopolitically, to the Russians no longer being able to export oil and grain. This is all leading up to the fact that when the Soviet Union collapsed, all of these resources came out on the market. China became the workshop of the world, but now all of that is coming to an end. And we have to figure out who we can reliably partner up with to actually get those goods and services from point of production to point of final assembly to your use. But the real issue is that we have to rework the entire infrastructure chain to actively supply that. And that isn't just roads and bridges and rail that have to be moved or have to be refocused between moving from the port of Los Angeles over to Texas. It's that if it's assembled in Texas, it now has to go all the directions out. That takes time to reorient that, and particularly what takes time is the industrial plant to be built here within the United States or North America to facilitate that. That is being done. That has been done largely since Trump took office. It really has taken off since COVID started, but the long and the short is that this is still a project that takes a decade, and we're largely more or less in year 4 of it, or 3 at best. This is not over yet. Even if we fight tooth and nail to keep inflation down, either we're probably going to see what we would call as a major recession because people can no longer afford the price of goods and services coming in, or we're going to be eating it through the teeth to continue to compete against each other to buy these limited resources and these limited things that we want when everybody's still participating in the system. Trade is really fun because you take the supply and demand curve of a particular commodity. Let's just say that you're wanting to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, right? You have to take that oil, convert that into the currency that the Saudis use, and forgive me, I forget which one it is. Then you take it into the currency that you are going to use within your own system. Let's just say it's the dollar, right? You're going to use that oil here. You then have the own value for the dollar that is separate from the Saudi Arabian currency and also separate from the actual value of that particular oil. And then you integrate it into the American market, which means the oil that you have just bought is now integrated into the American oil market and now is affecting the price at its own independent and individual level. This is how we get something called purchasing power parity, how we get to that point where the American dollar is exorbitantly more worth the Mexican peso, but for some reason the Mexican peso can consistently buy more than what should be expected at a dollar for dollar exchange. Is that the goods and services that the peso can buy is at completely different price points than the goods and services that the dollar can buy, because they're entirely two localized markets. And that is going to lead us into the very next presentation. Next time on Geopolitics TyberiusD, we're going to take that segment and we're just going to roll right into it. We're going to be talking about foreign and local trade, largely how we have integrated economies of scale to where you have this economy over here, you have this economy over here, and this economy over here, and how they all interrelate. These two are local economies and how they interrelate. We'll talk about what facilitates their growth, their expenditure, and more particularly, their greater economic ability when they're integrated, versus what happens when you have an entirely different or foreign integrated system and how those two overall relate on a global scale. Because one of the things that I think a lot of people don't understand, and one of the things that I have a serious gripe with modern economics is that we have this idea called comparative advantage, in the sense that basically each nation will specialize in the things that they do best in the same way that people do. What they don't account for is the difference in the value added scale. What happens if you have an entire society of people who are making $10 an hour versus another society of people that are making $2 a day? There is a significant value added discrepancy within those systems, and they aren't comparable to each other in some of the ways that we think they are. Now, granted, I'm one of like 4 people that actively challenges the mainstream narrative when it comes to this in economics, but I'm going to explain to you in that particular episode why I think that foreign trade is something that we seriously need to revisit, because I think one of the underlying basic assumptions is actually wrong. So definitely come check that out. After this, we got a few major political conversations that we're absolutely going to be getting into. We're going to be talking about the morality of politics. We're going to be talking about the rise of the seventh party system and how the old Democrats of old aren't the same as what they are now, and obviously the Republicans aren't either. We're going to be talking about why the politics that we're normally used to are completely off the rails. We're going to talk about what the moral differences between the right and the left, and why somebody who simply disagrees with you might not be wrong. They're just looking at the world through a different lens. When it comes to the seven-party system, we'll be talking about why the Republicans and why the Democrats just seem to be so different compared to what they used to be, and where they're probably going and why they're going to end up turning that way. Just for the sake of argument, at some point, I may even get into my own personal politics. That's on the list of things that I might do, and it's not that I don't obviously interject how I feel about things, but if anyone wants just my general thesis statement, definitely leave comments down below, and we will do that as its own individual presentation. Last but not least, we're finally going to be doing national spotlights and the geopolitical history again. We're going to be talking about France as our first contender up on the list. I've actually already started doing the script for the geopolitical history of France, but the national spotlight is going to be coming up. We're going to be talking about Macron. We're going to be talking about the parliament. We're going to talk about the economy and the military. We're going to be talking about modern France and the spotlight of, hey, is this a country that is built and ready for success? Does it have some problems, or are we waiting for disaster to come and unfold? France will be the first country that we revisit in that particular series, and after which, of course, we're going to get back into that geopolitical history. I'm working on a light-handed documentary on basically the geopolitical history here, and everything from the Merovingians to the split of Francia, which led to France and Germany, all the way up into the modern era to where, does France really deserve their notion of being a country of white flags, or have they actually been the most militarily competent nation in all of Europe, and they really just ran into a bad day when it came into World War II? Without further ado, thank you all very much for joining me, and I can't wait to see you again.
Thank you, Tyberius. That was quite the show. But folks, I am your King of Extreme, Phil KOE. But most importantly, I am here to tell you about the man Tyberius D. You just saw him and the way that you can follow him. The best way you can do it. Go to YouTube, Tyberius D, give him a subscribe. Tyberius D on Twitch, give him a follow. Tyberius D on TikTok, give him a follow. Most importantly, patreon.com/Tyberius_D to make yourself a small part of that story, folks. Make yourself a part of this story, the Tyberius D story, the one for you, the one for me, the one that we all need to engage and indulge in, folks. We're just getting started here, folks, but I can't wait to see you back here. I hope all of you make it back here to Tyberius D on YouTube, TikTok, and Twitch. Happy, healthy, much the wiser. Catch you around.